Tonight at 10, another grim warning from the UN that there's no credible way of limiting the rise in global warming. We have a special report from a region of the Arctic Circle which is warming more quickly than any other place on Earth, with devastating effects.
And all wildlife here in Svalbard is having to adapt to this hotter world.
The Prime Minister, seen here at last year's COP26 climate summit in Glasgow, has decided not to attend this year's summit in Egypt, drawing heavy criticism.
Our Prime Minister will be missing in action, and what he obviously fails to understand is that tackling the climate crisis is also the way to lower energy bills, create jobs and give us energy security.
We'll have more on the latest warnings from the UN and evidence of the damage that's being done in the Arctic, also tonight. President Putin warns that the coming decade will be the most dangerous and unpredictable since the end of the Second World War. In Northern Ireland, the latest efforts to form a new governing executive have failed. There could be new elections by Christmas. And why schools that try to ban pupils from wearing their afro hair in a certain style are likely to be breaking the law.
On BBC London, a woman is found guilty of the murder and decapitation of her church friend for money, and how the police is going for quality and not quantity when recruiting.
Good evening. There's been another grim warning from the UN that there's no credible way of limiting the rise in global warming. A new report talks of woefully inadequate action by the world's governments to keep the rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, as leaders prepare to gather for COP27, that is the global climate conference taking place this year in Egypt, the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has decided not to attend. Downing Street says he has other pressing domestic commitments, including the autumn budget. But the decision has been heavily criticised by political opponents and by environmental campaigners. In a moment, we'll have a special report on the environmental damage being done in the Arctic Circle. But first, our climate editor, Justin Rolat, has the latest.
Catastrophic floods in Nigeria have driven more than 1 million people from their homes this month. An example of the kind of extreme weather science says will become more common as our climate changes. And we had a second day of dire warnings from the United Nations, underscoring just how urgent the threat is. The world is on track for a rise of 2.8 degrees this century, with devastating consequences for millions of people, the report said. Yesterday, UN Chief Antonio Guterres told the BBC he wanted Rishi Sunak to attend.
The presence of the new British Prime Minister would be very encouraging for all of us.
Hosts of the Glasgow summit last year, the UK formally hands over responsibility for the UN climate talks in Egypt. But today we learned the Prime Minister will not be going. Number 10 says he's too busy with other commitments, but his predecessor, Liz Truss, was planning to attend. Egypt says more than 90 world leaders, including US President Joe Biden, will be there.
We were the hosts of the last climate summit, and now our Prime Minister will be missing in action. And what he obviously fails to understand is that tackling the climate crisis is also the way to lower energy bills, create jobs and give us energy security.
It's easy to forget the threat global warming presents when the weather's like this. Tourists were enjoying a balmy autumn on the French Riviera today, but the blistering summer heat in Europe and around the world hit harvests of key crops. It's another reason we're paying so much for food at the moment, and another reason we should worry about our changing climate. Well, Hugh, there's no question the UN will be very disappointed. The British Prime Minister will not be attending the climate conference in Egypt. Only yesterday, the UN chief was telling me how important it is that world leaders go to these conferences. They galvanise the process, he said, encouraging people to reach ambitious agreements. And you'll remember, Hugh, Liz Truss advised King Charles not to go. So that leaves Alok Sharma, who headed the Glasgow summit, leading the UK at this UN climate summit in Egypt.
Justin, many thanks again. Justin Rolat, our climate editor there in New York. Well, we'll stay with this story because one place where the impact of climate change is increasingly evident is Svalbard, and that's in the Arctic Circle. The Norwegian islands are warming more quickly than any other place on Earth. Our Europe correspondent Nick Beake has travelled there for this special report.
Venture deep into the Arctic Circle and you find Svalbard. There's no place quite like it. And here, a struggle for survival. Climate change is on fast forward. Polar explorer Hilde Farmström wants to show us how her world is disappearing. Soon, an incredible sight, but one framed with sadness.
To survive as a polar bear now, I think you have to be super good at hunting because the main source of food, the seals, they are diminishing, and the ice that both the seal and the polar bears are dependent on are diminishing. It's getting less and less ice.
This Norwegian archipelago is warming 6 times faster than the global average. There's much less ice here to reflect heat and more exposed ocean to absorb it.
These beluga whales, they're swimming in water that's much hotter than it used to be.
And all wildlife here in Svalbard is having to adapt to this hotter world. You can hear them now. It's hotter
In the water.
and it's hotter in the air too. Melting here raises sea levels and affects weather patterns across the globe. In what is the northernmost settlement in the world, it's life on the edge. Houses are being moved and rebuilt, new barriers installed to stop more avalanches triggered by the thawing ground.
Wherever I look around us, I see change.
And leading polar scientist Kim Holloman tells us the war in Ukraine is now undermining the effort to understand climate change.
The official exchange with Russian institutions is not possible at this time. Half of the Arctic is Russian coastline. And if we are unable to share knowledge and data, it will hamper our ability to understand what is happening. It will. We need each other in order to do good science.
Svalbard attracts tens of thousands of visitors every year, putting further strain on this fragile environment. But the authorities claim they're moving towards renewable energy.
Now we are in one of the 2 production sites we have here in mine number 7. We are 8 kilometers in the mine.
This is Svalbard and Norway's last coal mine, which we're told is due to close.
It makes me sad. It was a mining town and now it's coming to an end. It's more and more of a tourist town.
But just a fortnight after our visit, the state-owned company announces it's delaying the closure. Why? It says Europe's energy crisis now makes the mine a more profitable operation. If they can't give up fossil fuels in the fastest warming place on Earth, what hope for the rest? The UN says we face a climate emergency. The alarm is sounding. We ignore it at our peril. Nick Beake, BBC News, in the Arctic Circle.
And following that special report by Nick, there are more updates, more news, more analysis from Justin Rowlatt and others on climate change. BBC News Online, it's all there for you, bbc.co.uk/news. And of course, you can use the BBC News app on your mobile device. Now, in Russia, President Putin has warned that the coming decade will be the most dangerous and unpredictable since the end of the Second World War. Speaking in Moscow, he defended Russia's actions in Ukraine and claimed that the Russian economy had survived the worst of the sanctions imposed by the West. He went on to accuse the former UK Prime Minister Liz Truss of being a girl out of her mind to talk about the use of nuclear weapons. Our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg reports from Moscow.
His war in Ukraine has not gone according to plan. But more than 8 months in, from Vladimir Putin, there were no regrets, no remorse. He blamed the West for the conflict and made only passing reference to the human cost of his invasion.
Of course, there's been a price to pay, primarily the losses connected to the special military operation. I'm always thinking about that. There are economic costs too, but there are enormous gains. Without any doubt, what's happening now will ultimately benefit Russia and its future. It will strengthen our sovereignty.
Strength is what the Kremlin leader is trying to project. This week, he oversaw massive exercises by Russia's strategic nuclear forces. A clear message to the West: don't mess with Moscow. President Putin was reminded he'd once said that in a nuclear war, Russians would go to heaven and the enemy to hell. We're in no rush to go to heaven, are we? He asks. There's a long pause. Your silence is worrying me, he says.
I paused on purpose, so that you'd be worried.
Vladimir Putin rejected Western accusations he's been engaged in nuclear saber-rattling. Russia, he claimed, had nothing to gain from a nuclear strike on Ukraine. But the fact remains that on the day of the invasion, he'd issued a very public warning. Any country that gets in Russia's way, he said, would face consequences the like of which they'd never experienced in history.
And the warnings continue.
According to Russian official nuclear doctrine, Russia would launch a strategic nuclear strike against the United States and all the NATO countries as soon as we witness the launch of Western missiles, no matter how armed they are, against our territories. And then the whole planet will die.
Moscow may be hoping nuclear rhetoric will scare the West into reducing support for Ukraine. It hasn't so far. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News.
What we saw and heard today was the world according to Vladimir Putin, and it is a world in which he is the good guy and the West is the villain. That is the script the Kremlin leader sticks to, and it's why we heard him today accuse the West of igniting the war in Ukraine, and it's why we heard him talk about the emergence of a new world order, which he says should be based on law and justice. Remember, this is the president who 8 months ago invaded a sovereign, independent nation, his neighbour, Ukraine.
Steve, many thanks again. Steve Rosenberg, our Russia editor, with the latest analysis there in Moscow. Now, the oil giant Shell has paid no windfall tax in the UK, despite making global profits of nearly £26 billion so far this year. Rishi Sunak had introduced the Energy Profits Levy in May, when he was Chancellor, to help pay for support for British households hit by the cost of living crisis. Today's news has prompted calls for increased taxes on the profits of energy firms. Our business editor Simon Jack is with me to explain more. Simon.
Thank you, Hugh. Yes, those same high oil and gas prices that are squeezing household and businesses are creating bumper profits at the companies that sell it, like Shell. In the 3 months to the end of September alone, Shell made £8.2 billion, more than double what it made in the same period last year. It means so far, in total this year, it's made £26 billion. And here's why. This is the oil price, and you can see just there, that's the spike after Russia invaded Ukraine, and it's remained high for several months before falling recently. But here's the real horror show. This is the price of gas, which has gone up to 8 to 10 times its long-term average price over the last few months. Companies like Shell are prospering from circumstances and prices they didn't control or expect. So little wonder there are calls to tax these massive profits. But it's not that straightforward. The vast majority, almost all of Shell's income and profits come from outside the UK. They have operations in 70 countries, and those operations are taxed in those countries. On their UK operations, they already face much higher tax rates than other companies, a 30% corporation tax rate, a 10% oil and gas levy, and on top of that, a 25% windfall tax on UK operations. a total of 65% tax rate on UK operations. However, on paper, Shell hasn't made a profit in the UK since 2017, as it offsets things like decommissioning oil rigs perfectly legally, and can further offset the recent windfall tax by investing in new UK energy. But they have and will also dish out tens of billions of pounds to shareholders, which, by the way, include pension funds. And watching large amounts of money paid out from a UK headquartered company at a time of a cost of living crisis creates bafflement and outrage that there aren't simpler answers to very complex and pressing problems.
Simon, many thanks. Simon Jack there, our business editor. Well, in Northern Ireland, the situation is now at crisis point. The latest efforts to form a new governing executive have failed. So major decisions on public services, including sorting out record NHS waiting lists, are still on hold. Business leaders say that the political instability is damaging investment and damaging job creation. Now, back in May, the Nationalist Party, Sinn Féin, for the first time, they won the biggest number of seats in that Stormont Assembly. And they've called on the DUP, the Unionists and the main Unionist Party, to support the election of a Speaker so that they can then form a governing executive. But the DUP has a different view. It's so far refused because it believes Northern Ireland's place in the UK is being undermined by the post-Brexit deal that was signed by Boris Johnson. Now, that deal, which is known as the Protocol, sets out the trading arrangements between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Goods being transported from one to the other are subject to checks, and the Democratic Unionists are against that. So if there's no deal by tonight, new elections will be called, probably for the 15th of December. And there are fears that a new set of elections could lead to more tensions. Let's join our Ireland correspondent, Chris Page, for the latest.
8 months have passed since Northern Ireland last had a functioning devolved government. At the start of another deadline day, the Democratic Unionist Party made clear the Stormont shutdown wouldn't be ending.
I have the backing of the people of Northern Ireland who voted for the DUP and gave us the mandate that we have to take the position that we hold. That's the backing that matters to me. And if we need to, we will go back to the people and we will seek to refresh and renew our mandate.
Arrangements will be set in place.
The other 4 main parties in the Assembly want power sharing to be restored immediately. As things stand, Michelle O'Neill of Sinn Féin is in line to be First Minister. In a special recall meeting, she accused the DUP of holding most voters to ransom.
Jeffrey Donaldson and the DUP are in a perpetual standoff with the public, the majority of whom they do not speak for or indeed represent. He stood for election, yet failed to show up. This is his mess and a failure of leadership by him and his party.
As expected, the DUP blocked the process to put in place a Speaker.
Therefore, we can proceed no further.
The politicians who were elected only 5 months ago haven't had the opportunity to spend much time in the Assembly chamber. Now they're leaving it for the last time before the midnight deadline. It's likely that before Christmas, they're going to have to ask people for their votes once again.
The political system in Northern Ireland is different to almost everywhere else. It's based on the Good Friday Peace Agreement, signed in 1998 after a long conflict. A majority of Unionists and Irish nationalists must agree to share power for a devolved government to be formed. The DUP says it won't join a coalition until the Brexit trade border in the Irish Sea is scrapped. In Belfast city centre, people don't seem to like the idea of going to the polls in December.
Waste of time.
Waste of time?
Yeah, because if the DUP don't partake, why have an election?
The cost of living is a disgrace, so definitely things need to change.
Would you be enthusiastic about voting again?
No, not one bit.
So will voters use the election to let off steam? This cafe owner is among thousands of business people here dealing with rising costs. She's largely lost faith in Northern Ireland's politics as another campaign comes closer.
To be brutally honest, I won't open the door because it's an absolute farce. I'm sick, sore and tired of
the same thing over and over again. Absolutely nothing changes, and yet again it's businesses in Northern Ireland. We're a small business economy who are keeping Northern Ireland working. We are in Groundhog Day again, you know, having an election for what outcome?
In the past, deadlines here have been known to come and go with little consequence. But it doesn't feel as if it'll be like that this time. It's all but inevitable that as autumn turns into winter, the ballot box will beckon. So it's about an hour and 40 minutes now until the legal deadline for the devolved government to be formed. Clearly there's going to be no return to power sharing this side of midnight, so it'll be over to the Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, who's made clear he will be calling an election. Now, the leader of the Cross Community Alliance Party, Naomi Long, was among those making the point today that elections in Northern Ireland tend to increase the divisions between parties, not bring politicians together. Most analysts believe that in the campaign, the DUP and Sinn Féin may well increase their support. If there is consensus about anything around here tonight, it's that sending voters back to the polls 10 days before Christmas isn't likely to increase the chances of a resolution to the crisis in the new year.
Chris, many thanks again. Chris Page, our correspondent there at Stormont. Let's have a look at some of the other stories making the news today. One person has died and 4 others injured in a stabbing in a supermarket near Milan. Among the injured in the attack in Sago was the footballer Pablo Mari, who's on a loan from Arsenal. The 46-year-old suspect has been detained and terrorism has been ruled out. 7 SNP members of the Scottish Parliament have voted against the Scottish Government's gender recognition legislation. 2 abstained. It was the biggest rebellion since the party came to power in 2007. The Scottish Government says the changes would make it simpler and less traumatic for someone to change gender, but opponents fear it would undermine women's rights. The bill cleared its first parliamentary hurdle by 88 votes to 33.
There are universal values that should define football.
Australia's football squad have released a video message attacking Qatar's human rights record just weeks before the start of the Men's World Cup. It criticises the treatment of migrant workers and of the LGBTQ+ community. Campaigners here say they don't think anyone from their communities should be travelling to watch the finals.
I'm not aware of a single out gay football fan that wants to go, and I'm told by hundreds of other LGBT+ fans of football, nobody is interested in going, and all the different groups are reporting the same issues, that people don't want to go because it's not a place that LGBT+ people are welcome.
A long-awaited memoir by the Duke of Sussex is due to be published in the new year. Prince Harry's publisher, Penguin Random House, said the book will be titled Spare and will give the story of his life, including the death of his mother in 1997 and his decision to give up royal duties and move to the US. Despite the ruthless response of the security forces, the protests in Iran seem to be escalating. Overnight, thousands turned out to mark 40 days since the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, who died in police custody after being arrested for not wearing a hijab properly. The protests have grown to be a wider rejection of the hardline government of Iran, with protesters setting fire to some public buildings. Our analysis editor, Roz Atkins, looks at the roots of the crisis.
Once more, protests are sweeping Iran. Once more, they're facing a crackdown. But the violence directed at protesters can't hide that something extraordinary is happening. Yesterday, thousands gathered at the grave of a young woman who died last month after being in custody. And this is a movement now driven by Iranian women. BBC Persian's Rana Rahimpour has been covering the protests since they began.
6 weeks on, and many Iranian women are already living a different life. They refuse to wear the headscarf when they go out in public, and they continue to fight.
This is Tehran in May. Every woman has their head covered. This is Tehran this week. Not wearing a headscarf is illegal for Iranian women. More and more women, though, are ignoring that. Something that was unthinkable weeks ago. And every night, people still open their windows and chant, "Death to the dictator," a message they're aiming at Iran's supreme leader. These protests were sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini. She was 22. She's buried in Saqqez in the northwest of Iran. And with Wednesday marking 40 days since her death, security forces tried to block access to the city. But the protesters would not be denied.
I have never been as hopeful as I am today. Woman, life, freedom. Zan, zendegi, azadi.
And all of these protests and acts of defiance come at a cost. Videos on social media, verified by the BBC, show people being beaten by security officials. Here we see women without headscarves defying police. In this video, security forces gathered at a girls' school in Tehran on Monday. One of them shouts, "We have permission. Beat them all." Nationwide, one human rights group estimates that more than 13,000 people have been arrested and that at least 250 people have been killed, including children. And if we go back to 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini founded Iran's Islamic Republic. And these protests are a direct challenge to the Islamic laws that date back to then. Listen to this BBC report at the time.
There is undoubtedly genuine concern over exactly what is meant by an Islamic Republic. The most widely expressed fear is that it could well lead to the kind of repressive religious dictatorship that denies Iran the freedoms the revolution is supposed to have brought.
Women had the freedom to dress as they chose before 1979, but that changed, and some want that freedom back.
It's unclear where these protests are heading, but what's clear is that the relationship between the Iranian government and its society is completely broken down, and there's no going back from this point on.
The authorities insist all of this must stop, but there's no going back for this mother whose son died in custody. She recently took off her hijab, declaring that the religion it stood for was killing people. One woman's death has become about many women's lives. They say there's no going back to how they used to live. Ros Atkins, BBC News.
And you can watch more with Ros at 20 to midnight tonight on BBC One. It's also available on the iPlayer. That's in Ros Atkins on the week. And as I say, the details to access it are on the screen there. Now, schools that try to ban pupils from wearing their afro hair in certain styles are likely to be breaking the law. That's according to new guidance published today by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. It says students should not be unfairly singled out because of their hair and chosen style. Our Community Affairs correspondent Adina Campbell has the story.
The teacher basically said that it was disgusting, it wasn't school policy, and I needed to take it out.
We're not just speaking about what we may typically perceive as a large afro, we're also speaking about protective styles that are often related to communities of African and Caribbean heritage.
Why should I have to cut my hair and people can have their hair all the way down to their hips?
Just some of the experiences often heard by women with afro-textured hair. And for Ruby Williams, her story has been one of the most high-profile cases. She was repeatedly sent home by her teachers because her natural hair wasn't considered to be a reasonable size or length.
I was sitting in a lesson and a teacher came and took me out and took me into a changing room in the school and with her own hairbands tried to twist the bunches to make them smaller and to make them into buns. And at the time, in my head, I was looking in the mirror and I knew, obviously, this is wrong. I'm not meant to be getting my hair touched by a teacher. Like, this isn't her role.
Ruby and her family successfully took legal action against her school in East London, funded by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And today, the watchdog has published new guidance, which says people with afro hair should not be prevented from wearing natural hairstyles, and if they are, it's likely to be unlawful.
We hope school leaders, if they're going to develop policies, to really think about how those policies might affect different groups of children and young people.
At the moment, this is only guidance, but it is being seen by hair equality campaigners as a significant step forward. Black people are disproportionately impacted by hair discrimination at school and in the workplace, according to the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And the long-lasting impact in many cases can be devastating.
I was having to go into my exams and then being escorted from the premises, literally just because of my hair being out. There was one point I was sitting doing an exam and through the door I could see two teachers waiting for me to speak to me about the fact that my hair was out.
The government says it provided guidance to schools last year to help them adhere to the Equality Act with regards to pupils' appearance and the needs of different cultures, races and religions.
Thursday to Monday.
Ruby's school did not accept any liability in her case, but she hopes today's new advice will better protect girls and boys like her. Adina Campbell, BBC News.
Right, the time is 10:30 and Nick is with me with the weather. Hi, Nick.
Hi, Hugh. If you think it's warm here for the time of year, further south from us in Europe and into northwest Africa, that heat is on a different level. If the summer wasn't hot enough, we're talking temperatures into the upper 20s, low to mid 30s. That's where our air is coming from. Here today we've seen high teens and low 20s, but from Morocco through Spain and into France, these are some of the temperatures we've seen today compared with the long-term October average, so around 10 degrees or more. Now, we know it is warm for the time of year here, but it's also rainy at times too. We've got low pressure to the west of us. Another wet weather system is gathering to move through overnight and into tomorrow morning, and then clearing to sunny spells in the afternoon. The latest rainfall picture over the past few hours shows that range is starting to appear here, so it'll be turning wetter as the night goes on from southwest England into Wales, especially Northern Ireland. And as that rain runs into western Scotland in the morning, there's a chance of seeing some flooding and some disruption, and the winds are strengthening too with coastal gales in the west. And these are temperatures which we might normally see by day at this time of year. That's how we start the day tomorrow. So windy, wet, some rain pushing across northern England, weakening as it moves further east across towards East Anglia and the southeast. Then by the afternoon, well, away from the far north of Scotland and Northern Isles, you'll see there's a lot of dry weather around. Broken clouds, sunny spells, just a chance of a shower. It's a windy day though, and from North Wales northwards, some gusts 50 miles an hour or so, maybe for a time in northern Scotland, 60 miles per hour. Temperatures take a little bit of a step backwards, but they'll come right back up again on Saturday to similar levels we have seen today. Friday evening, if you're out and about, it is looking fine. Overnight and into Saturday morning, we'll see another weather system coming in. So northern and western parts on Saturday with rain, mainly north and west for showers on Sunday. Some sunny spells around too. Mild, windy, gradually turning cooler on through next week.
OK, Nick, many thanks once again. Nick Miller there with the latest on the weather. That's BBC News at 10 on Thursday, the 27th of October. More analysis, of course, of the day's main stories, and that's on Newsnight, coming up with my colleague Kirsty Walk, just about getting underway on BBC Two. Here on BBC One, well, the news continues, of course, as it always does, with all of our colleagues in the nations and regions ready with the news where you are. But from the 10 team, thanks for watching and good night.